Richard Gary Brautigan. Well, born January 30th, 1935 in Tacoma, Washington. His father was Bernard Frederick Brautigan Jr., known as Ben, born in 1908, and his mother was Lulu Mary, known as Mary Lou Keogh, who was born in 1911. Anyhow, I want to step back a year or two and basically give you a little bit about his pre-birth, because it's very important to what Juju was talking about. In May of 1934, Mary Lou Keogh, a part-time waitress who traveled from diner to diner, from bar to bar in the Northwest, met her first husband. Now again, there's question about this. We don't know if it's a first husband or not, but that was her claim, right to her deathbed, which was in 2005. And she met Ben Brautigan, a factory worker and a day laborer who did the same thing. He would go from town to town to town to try to scrape money together. Now, we're not talking about this incredible amount of money and prestige. We're talking about poor, Northwestern poor, Western poor. So anyways, she somehow magically gets pregnant. And that's what she called it. Magically. And very quickly thereafter, she separates from Ben. She leaves him. And her quote, and this quote I got from W.P. Kinsella, he never drank enough. So anyways, Richard was born January of the following year. And just to let you know, Ben never knew a thing about it. So, anyways, between 1935 and 1938, Mary Lou and young Richard, moved several times from Washington to Oregon to Northern California, back to Washington. And during these times, they're living in motel rooms, renting night to night, 24-hour periods of time. And while she was doing this, she was waitressing. And as Richard Brautigan had mentioned in some of his early youth poetry, she was doing more than waitressing. But of course, Mary Lou on her deathbed said, "I was a good and great waitress." So anyways, 1938 rolls along, and Mary Lou and Richard removed to Great Falls, Montana. And of course, living in motel rooms, Mary Lou begins to live with a fellow by the name of Arthur Martin Titland, who she describes as a man who is a good drinker. Late 1938 through 39, she basically moves back to Tacoma, Washington, without Arthur. And then Arthur follows, and there's this constant moving, and they're living in different motel rooms once again. And so by May of 1939, Richard Brautigan's first sibling is born, Barbara Ann Titland, born in Tacoma. Barbara's still living. She lives in Northern California, and quite an amazing woman in her own right. But anyhow, in late 1939, Richard and Barbara and Mary Lou removed back to Great Falls to get back with Arthur, who's apparently living in motel rooms. Okay? And she begins to leave the kids for longer stretches of time. in these motel rooms. Now remember, Barbara is about a year old. And this is kind of making Richard a little nervous and concerned. And he's not of age to quantify or qualify what he's feeling. But anyhow, by 1940, Mary Lou leaves Richard and Barbara, who's now 2, in a motel room, a different motel room, because remember, they change motel rooms almost daily, for 3 days. And this is, quote unquote, his most traumatic childhood experience. And he calls it his very most traumatic childhood experience. And by the way, they have no food, and they have no running water. And where was his mother? Well, from what she said, she was being a good waitress. During this period of time, between 1940 and late 1942, they moved approximately 17 times. So, by late 1942, they tried to move back to Tacoma, and then they moved back to Montana, and there was lots and lots and lots and lots of upheaval, and there was no consistency. And Richard began to recognize this inconsistency. I don't necessarily know if it was for good or for bad, but he began to recognize it. So by the end of 1942, they're back in Tacoma, and his mother meets Robert Jeffrey Porterfield, a fry cook in the restaurant, which is where she was working. And finally, there's a moment of settling in Tacoma, as much as one could settle. And January 20th, 1943, Bob and Mary marry. They also move into Bob's house, who just so happened to, which is basically the first home Richard was able to identify as a consistent home. A bed. Granted, the bed was on a floor, but it was a bed nonetheless. And at this particular point in time, this is where his mother convinces Richard that Bob is his biological father. And this, again, in his own words, a mind fuck. And he was convinced for a long period of time, and he actually changed his name to Richard Gary Porterfield. So April 1st, 1945, Richard's second half-sister was born in Tacoma, Sandra Jean Porterfield. And at this same time, Richard is recognizing, and his mother recognizing, that this is not a great family unit. It's a mess. And again, late 1946, Mary Lou packs up and leaves Bob and goes and removes to Eugene, Oregon, or the surrounding areas, because it was not quite, they didn't quite know where they were, but they were in motel rooms. Staying in motel rooms and rooming houses. She's working as a waitress, living on welfare. And my favorite quote is, eating rat feces, sifted flour and water pancakes. And some days not eating at all. So we're getting that whole grim early childhood perspective. And so by 1947, Mary Lou divorces Bob. And at this point in time, Richard is about 12, and he begins to write and journal. And everything that he's written and journaled at this particular point in time is now going to be the last thing that's ever published, and it's all after death for him. So late 49, Mary Lou meets William David Falston Sr., known as Billy. And her quote is, "The best drinker I've ever met." Not only was he the best drinker she ever met, this is when Richard recognizes that his mother's nuts. She sticks with this guy for the rest of her life, just to let you know. And she's beaten daily. And this is where he begins to ward off this idea that of generosity of men and mothers. So June 12th, 1950, Billy and Mary marry. And by December of 1950, his third half-sibling is born, William David Falston Jr., known as W.D. And by this point in time, Eugene becomes their settled home. And Richard, at this same time, graduates from the Woodrow Wilson Junior High School with honors. Technically, it was third in his class of a little over 700 children. That's pretty darn good. And Richard enters September 12th. He enters Eugene High, at which the school is fascinated by him because he's 6'4". So they're saying, "Oh boy, he would be a great athlete." And so his freshman year, he joins the basketball team, and he makes All-Star. And he also writes for the Eugene High School News. And he's still growing. So anyways, by 51, Richard becomes editor of his high school newspaper. By 52, Richard writes his first published poem called "The Light." That was published late in 52. And so June 9th, 1953, Richard graduates with honor, graduates top 5% of his class. And we believe, and again, there's been a lot of debate about this, he begins to see that he has the ability to change, to make sure, to bring about a new writing style. And this is also a time where he begins to make his friends that last him his lifetime. And one of them being Peter Webster, who was his friend all throughout high school. And he moves in with Peter and Peter's mother, Edna. And he basically takes in Edna as his surrogate mother. And he disavows his family. And this is probably the first stable time in his entire life. He wakes up, he has breakfast, he eats lunch, he has dinner. There's no worries. He's enjoying himself. And he begins to journal and write frantically. Now, nothing really comes at this point, but he's writing and journaling frantically. So, about a year later, August of 54, he decides to leave for the first time for San Francisco. And he's going there on a journey to become the writer that he knows he is. Because now he's decided, I'm going to be a writer. And I'm going to write successfully, and I'm going to make some dough, because I'm tired of being poor. And so he begins to again write. He's continuing writing and journaling frantically. And Richard fluctuates, due to the lack of money, between Eugene, Oregon and San Francisco. And By December 1955, really he hits bottom. He hits emotional bottom. Now, just to let you know, he and Peter were known in high school as the party kids. But anyways, December 14th, 1955, Richard is arrested for throwing a rock through a police station window. So everybody says, why did you do that? He said, I wanted to be sent to prison because I was hungry and cold. December 20th of that same year, Richard again is arrested for disorderly conduct and is fined $25. And he's pissed off at the cop for giving him a fine because he wanted to go back in the can because he was hungry and he was cold. And he continued this erratic behavior, and the police department was noting this erratic behavior, so they committed him to the Oregon State Hospital. So, police, why did the police do that? Because of his erratic behavior. But what happens in there is life-changing. He's diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and clinical depression. That's not the big thing. He didn't really care about that. He didn't believe it. He didn't think it was true and didn't think it existed. Those were just concoctions of a lunatic called Freud. And he was also treated with electroconvulsive therapy, which didn't really help much. But he began his first book, The God of the Martians. And this is where he got his revelation, I am a writer. So by February 19th, 1956, Richard is released. He briefly goes back and lives with his mother and stepfather and siblings in Eugene. And he realizes they're crazy and I want nothing to do with them. And that's his final cut with his mother and his stepfather. They never speak again. But April of 56, Richard moves permanently back to San Francisco, and he sought to establish himself as a San Franciscan writer. And he begins handing out his poetry on the streets and in the clubs. He begins the spoken word on the streets and in clubs, as well as bookstores. And so he types a 3-page manuscript and he sends it to the Macmillan Company for publication. And I'll kind of explain that to you a little bit. This publication was 3 pages long. 2 pages of it were 14 short poems. And the final page of it was a dedication to Linda, which was essentially an on-again, off-again woman in his life. And he sent this into them, and they did reply. They sent him a letter back, and it was a rejection letter. But the rejection letter stated this: what is it, and what the hell are we going to do with it? Just to let you know, 2.5 years later, 3 of those poems are published, as well as the dedication to Linda, in another book, which I'll explain later on. So I'm going to move ahead. About 57, early 57, he meets Virginia Dion Adler. At the time, a very early feminist and a writer in Reno, Nevada. He moves to Reno for a little R&R. His R&Rs consisted of bourbon, malt liquor, unfiltered Pall Mall cigarettes, and really, really bad women. So we have to keep that constant in our mind as he's progressing. I'm going to leave it at that, and we've got Dan coming up.